this problem, we want to solve for x, or one of the missing sides of this right triangle. Now, to do this, we're going to use trig. So there's some steps that we always follow whenever we want to solve for a missing side using trig. And so the first step is to identify your theta, or your angle that you know other than the 90 degrees. So we've got the 90 here represented by that little corner, like square corner. That's 90. But what we care about is another angle that's given in the triangle. So we can see that that's 26 degrees. Now this is really important as a first step because that angle determines our step 2, which is to label our sides, because we label the sides in relation to that angle. So we're going to label the opposite side, the hypotenuse, and the adjacent side. So it usually is best to start to go like in this order, but you don't have to go in that order. The opposite side is the side that's directly across from this angle that we just labeled or identified. So you kind of look through the triangle, across, like through the middle, and it's the side that's not touching that angle at all. So like this 14 is sort of touching that blue angle. This X side is sort of touching that blue angle, but the opposite side isn't connected to it at all. It's directly across from it. Okay, so I'm going to label that as OPP for opposite side. Next is the hypotenuse. Now the hypotenuse is across from the 90. So like we said before, this is 90, so the hypotenuse is across from that. You also know the hypotenuse because it's always the longest side in the triangle. So I'll label it HYP for hypotenuse. And then that leaves the adjacent side, which is X in this case. Now the thing that you can use to identify the adjacent side is it always connects the angle that you labeled with the 90 degrees. So if you look at that angle and the 90 and find the side that connects those two angles, that's always your adjacent side. Adjacent means next to, so it's sort of like next to that angle. All right, so we've labeled our 3 sides. That's a really important step. If you get this step wrong, labeling the sides, the rest of your problem is going to be wrong, even if you kind of know what you're doing. So this is really important. Okay, so now we're on to step 3, which is to set up a trig equation. So we're going to first have to decide which trig equation to use. Now there's 3, sine, cosine, and tangent. So the thing to know here is that sine of your angle is always equal to the opposite over the hypotenuse side. Opposite over hypotenuse. Your cosine equation is always going to be the cosine of theta, or your angle, equals the adjacent side over the hypotenuse. And your tangent equation is always tangent of theta, your angle, equals the opposite side over the adjacent side. And I'll make all of that a little smaller so it all fits on the screen. There we go. Okay, so you got to pick one of these to use, and there's only one right equation to use in any given problem. So it's your job to figure out which one is the right one to use. So we determine that based off of what is labeled in our diagram. So our equation should include the side that has the X, right? That's the side that you want to find. You want that to be somewhere in the equation so that you can solve for it. So we want to have, in this case, our X side is the adjacent side. So we need our equation, whichever one we choose, it has to have the adjacent side as part of the equation. So just looking at these 3, we see adjacent here and here, but it's not in the sine equation at all. So that's already a clue that we're not going to use the sine one because it doesn't have the adjacent side in it anywhere at all. Okay, so the other piece of information in your triangle that you should look for besides the X is the side that you know. Now, we don't know anything about the opposite side. I don't know how long that is. Do you? No. But I do know that the hypotenuse has a length of 14. That is the other side that we do know. So that side also needs to be in our equation. So we know that we're choosing a side that has adjacent in it, or sorry, we know we are choosing an equation that has adjacent in it, and we're also choosing an equation that has hypotenuse in it. So we're looking for one of these guys that has adjacent and also hypotenuse. So that's cosine, right? Tangent over here, you can see it has adjacent, but it has opposite, not hypotenuse. So it doesn't have both of the sides that we need it to have. So really, cosine is the only trig equation that has both adjacent and hypotenuse. So that's the one that we have to choose. Okay, so now that we've figured out our angle, we've labeled our sides, we've identified which equation we should be setting up, now all that's left to do is set up the equation and solve for x. So we're going to set this up following our template for our equation. So it says cosine of theta, and theta is just a fancy symbol that stands for the angle. So we've got cosine of theta. Now instead of theta, we're going to actually put the angle that we know, not 90, but the other one, so 26 degrees. So we have cosine of 26, and then next in our equation is the equal sign, so equals, and then last we have a fraction with adjacent on top and hypotenuse on the bottom. So we'll set up a fraction with our adjacent side on top. Our adjacent side was labeled, that was labeled on the x side, so x is our adjacent side, that goes on top, and then hypotenuse, that was our 14, so that goes on the bottom. Okay, so at this point, we're really close to being done. We've set up our equation. Now all that's left is to solve. Now in this case, we want x by itself, and we see that x is divided by a number. So this is pretty simple to solve because the opposite of dividing is multiplying. So to get our x by itself, we're just going to multiply both sides by that 14. And the fraction will cancel out with the 14 that we just multiplied by. So now we've isolated our x. That's the whole point of solving, right? We want to get x by itself. And on the other side, we have this 14 times cosine 26. So I'm going to just write all that out. 14 times cosine of 26. Now, sometimes you want to give your answer as an exact answer, and that's what this is. It looks kind of complicated, but this is the true exact answer that you could give. Now, we could also punch this into our calculator, but cosine of 26, that's a number. So here you would punch this in as the cosine button on your calculator, and then the number 26, and then hit enter. Figure out what that is, and then multiply that times the 14 that's out in front. And you should end up with something close to 6.1. And because this is sort of rounded, that's what makes it approximate. We're not going to write all those decimals down. We're just going to round it to like the nearest tenth or whatever your teacher wants you to round to. And so that's why it's not the exact answer, but it's close enough. Versus here, when you don't round anything, that's when it is exact. So it just depends on what the problem is asking for, but just know that you can have either an exact answer or an approximate answer on these kinds of problems. So we've solved for our missing side, and now we always want to just go back and double check that our answer makes sense. So does it make sense that this adjacent side has a length of 6? Yeah, that's pretty reasonable. So we have our final answer, and the problem is done.